In a nondescript shipping facility, thousands of small, rectangular packages await clearance for export to China. Inside each one sits a piece of silicon no larger than a credit card that has become the center of the most consequential technology policy debate in decades. This isn't just any computer component. It's the H20, a processor specifically engineered to navigate the blurry line between what American regulations permit and what Chinese AI companies desperately need. For months, these chips were frozen in regulatory limbo after government officials determined they represented a strategic threat. Then, following a single dinner meeting between political leadership and Nvidia's chief executive, the policy reversed completely. The chips could ship again. What makes this reversal so significant isn't just the commercial implications for one company or the immediate impact on Chinese technology firms, it's what this decision reveals about two fundamentally incompatible visions of how to maintain technological advantage in an era-defining competition. One perspective holds that strategically providing limited access to American hardware will trap Chinese AI development in permanent dependency on U.S. technology. The opposing view argues that any access to advanced chips simply buys China time to develop domestic alternatives that will eventually eliminate that dependency entirely. Both strategies can't be correct simultaneously, and whichever approach actually reflects reality will determine whether American AI maintains its current edge or whether that advantage evaporates over the next few years. What follows is an exploration of why these particular silicon wafers matter so profoundly to global AI development, why smart people disagree so intensely about export strategy, and why the next 12 months of chip policy decisions might matter more than the next 5 years of algorithmic research. Why chips became the choke point? To understand why computer chips became the critical battleground in AI competition, you need to understand what actually limits AI development. It's not primarily about algorithms anymore. The mathematical techniques underlying modern AI systems are largely published in open research papers. It's not mainly about data. Both nations have access to massive data sets for training purposes. The fundamental constraint that determines which nation can build more capable AI systems faster is computational hardware. Training cutting-edge AI models requires performing quadrillions of mathematical calculations across distributed networks of specialized processors working in coordination for weeks or months continuously. Running those trained models to serve billions of user queries requires equally massive computational infrastructure operating with minimal latency. The nation that can deploy more computational power more efficiently gains the ability to train larger models, experiment with more architectural variations, and serve more users with better performance. For the past decade, American chip designers, overwhelmingly Nvidia, with contributions from AMD and Intel, have produced processors that substantially outperform anything manufactured elsewhere. This hardware advantage has been the primary factor allowing American AI companies to maintain their lead even as Chinese firms invested enormous resources in catching up. Chinese researchers have access to similar algorithms, comparable data, and equally talented engineers. What they've lacked is equivalent computational infrastructure. This created an obvious strategic vulnerability from the Chinese perspective and an equally obvious leverage point from the American viewpoint. If China remains dependent on American-designed chips, its AI capabilities can be throttled through export restrictions. If America can maintain its hardware advantage while denying China access to cutting-edge processors, the AI gap will widen rather than narrow over time. This is why chip export policy has become so intensely contested. It's the one domain where America possesses clear advantage and effective tools to prevent that advantage from eroding. The corporate response that outsmarted regulators. When export controls first took effect in 2022, they were written with specific technical parameters defining which chips could and couldn't be sold to Chinese entities. Any processor exceeding certain thresholds for computational performance and chip-to-chip communication speed was prohibited. This included Nvidia's flagship H20, which represented the state-of-the-art for AI training and deployment. What happened next reveals both Nvidia's engineering sophistication and the difficulty of writing effective technology export regulations. Rather than accepting the loss of Chinese sales, Nvidia engineers took the H100 design and deliberately degraded specific capabilities to create a modified version, the H800, that fell just below regulatory thresholds. This wasn't a fundamentally different chip. It was the same architecture with certain features intentionally limited to achieve regulatory compliance. Chinese AI companies immediately began purchasing H800s at maximum available volumes. They weren't as capable as unrestricted H100s, but they were vastly superior to any domestically available Chinese alternative. This allowed Chinese AI development to continue advancing, just at a somewhat slower pace than American competitors with access to unrestricted hardware. When regulators tightened restrictions to close this loophole, Nvidia responded by designing yet another variant, the H20. This version made different trade-offs, sacrificing some raw computational power to maximize the chip-to-chip communication speeds that make it particularly effective for deploying trained models at scale. Once again, Chinese companies bought every unit Nvidia could supply, and once again, Chinese AI capabilities continued advancing despite the restrictions. This created a revealing dynamic. Every time regulators closed one pathway, Nvidia's engineering teams found another technical configuration that provided value to Chinese customers while technically complying with export rules. The company was simultaneously obeying the letter of regulations while systematically undermining their strategic purpose. And because Nvidia's chips remained substantially better than Chinese alternatives even in degraded form, demand remained intense. The dependency theory and why it might fail. The strategic argument for reversing the H20 export ban rests on a theory about technology ecosystems and switching costs. If Chinese AI companies build their entire development infrastructure around Nvidia hardware, training their engineers on Nvidia tools, writing software optimized for Nvidia architectures, designing workflows that assume Nvidia performance characteristics, they become locked into that ecosystem. Switching to different hardware later requires rewriting massive amounts of code, retraining engineering teams, and redesigning workflows from scratch. Those switching costs create dependency that can be exploited strategically. The theory suggests that by continuing to provide chips that are good but not great, America keeps Chinese AI development viable enough that companies don't invest heavily in developing alternatives, but constrained enough that they can't fully compete with American systems. Chinese chip manufacturers, lacking customers for their products, struggle to improve because they can't generate revenue to fund research or obtain market feedback to guide development. Meanwhile, Chinese AI companies become increasingly entangled in Nvidia's ecosystem, making it progressively harder to switch even if better alternatives eventually emerge. If this theory proves correct, America would be executing a sophisticated strategic play, using short-term chip sales to prevent long-term Chinese competitiveness by forestalling the development of viable domestic alternatives. The temporary revenue Nvidia generates and the switching costs Chinese companies accumulate would both serve American strategic interests. But this theory contains a critical assumption that numerous experts believe is catastrophically wrong. It assumes Chinese technology development operates primarily through market mechanisms where companies make independent decisions based on commercial logic. That assumption ignores how Chinese industrial policy actually functions when the government designates something as strategically critical. How Chinese industrial policy actually works. China's approach to developing strategic technologies doesn't rely primarily on market competition to drive improvement. When the government identifies a capability as essential for national competitiveness or security, it mobilizes resources on scales and timelines that market-based systems struggle to match. Semiconductor development has been explicitly designated as exactly this type of strategic priority. The Chinese government has committed tens of billions of dollars in direct subsidies to domestic chip manufacturers. It has mandated that AI companies source significant percentages of their processors from domestic suppliers, creating guaranteed demand, regardless of whether those chips offer the best price-performance ratio. It has funded extensive research programs, provided preferential access to capital, and made clear that achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency is a priority national objective that will be pursued essentially regardless of cost. This means Chinese chip manufacturers will continue improving their capabilities whether or not they face immediate commercial competition from Nvidia. They're not depending on market revenue to fund research. They're receiving state backing. They're not relying on voluntary customer adoption. They're benefiting from government procurement mandates. The normal market mechanisms that create dependency and switching costs simply don't apply when the state is directing industrial development as a strategic imperative. Chinese chips currently lag Nvidia's by several years in capability, but they're advancing rapidly and they don't need to match Nvidia's performance to break the dependency cycle. They just need to become adequate for AI development purposes. Once Chinese processors cross the threshold from basically unusable to workable enough, the combination of government mandates, national security concerns about foreign dependency, and the strategic vulnerability of relying on potentially hostile suppliers will drive Chinese AI companies to switch regardless of switching costs. What the H20 actually accomplishes? If the dependency theory is flawed, what does allowing H20 exports actually achieve? From the Chinese perspective, it accomplishes something extremely valuable. It buys time. Chinese AI companies can continue developing sophisticated models and deploying them at scale using Nvidia hardware, while domestic chip manufacturers work to close the capability gap. Rather than falling years behind during the period when Chinese chips are inferior, Chinese AI development remains roughly competitive. The H20 functions as a bridge. It keeps Chinese AI viable during the vulnerable transition period when domestic hardware isn't yet adequate. It allows Chinese companies to continue training engineers, developing software, and building products that will eventually run on domestic chips once those become sufficient. And it prevents the scenario where Chinese AI falls so far behind that catching up becomes impossible even after domestic chips improve. From this perspective, current export policy isn't creating dependency. It's facilitating exactly the outcome America supposedly wants to prevent. It's helping China execute its strategic roadmap of remaining competitive in AI while developing semiconductor self-sufficiency, rather than forcing China to choose between those objectives. The higher stakes gamble on the horizon. The debate over H20 exports might soon be overshadowed by an even more consequential decision about the Blackwell B30 processor. This chip is 12 times more computationally powerful and 11 times faster at chip-to-chip communication than the H20. It represents a generational leap that would put Chinese AI companies within striking distance of the computational resources available to American frontier labs. If B30 exports get approved, the computational advantage that currently favors American AI largely evaporates. Chinese researchers would be able to train models of similar scale and sophistication using comparable timelines and resources. At that point, other factors that favor Chinese AI development, massive state investment, enormous domestic markets, fewer regulatory constraints on data usage, could allow China to establish parity or even advantages in specific domains. The strategic calculation becomes even more complex because chip policy is apparently becoming entangled with broader trade negotiations. Chinese officials have recently instructed domestic AI companies to reduce Nvidia purchases and promoted domestic chips as comparable alternatives. This could reflect genuine progress in Chinese chip capabilities. Or it could be strategic theater designed to pressure Nvidia into lobbying for approval to sell more capable chips by threatening the company's market access. These small pieces of silicon have become the primary battleground determining which nation achieves AI dominance, and two incompatible strategic theories are driving policy in opposite directions. One theory holds that providing controlled access to good but not great chips will trap China in permanent dependency on American technology. The other argues that any chip access simply delays China's inevitable transition to domestic alternatives while keeping its AI competitive during that transition. These strategies can't both be correct. If the dependency theory is right, current policy might prove strategically brilliant. If the bridging theory is right, America is helping China execute the exact strategy it should be trying to prevent. We'll likely know which theory reflects reality within the next few years based on whether Chinese AI capabilities converge with, diverge from, or surpass American ones. What's at stake isn't just commercial advantage for specific companies. It's technological leadership in what might be the most strategically consequential domain of the 21st century. And the decisions being made right now about whether chips can ship to China could matter more than any algorithmic breakthrough in determining who wins that competition.